The best lens for video for a Sony E-mount full-frame camera is actually boring. It's not a super wide-angle lens, and it's not a telephoto lens, nor is it a macro lens. It's not a power zoom. In fact, it's not a zoom at all. And it isn't a cool creamy color, and it doesn't have a dozen buttons on the side. It's a pretty no-nonsense lens. It's the Sony 35mm 1.4 G Master lens. Now, if you're a serious filmmaker, I think you should really consider this lens. If I could only choose one lens, it would be this lens. Yeah, that's how much I love it. Now, as I make my case for this lens, I am going to talk about some other lenses that might be close enough for you, because this Sony lens actually does cost $1,300. And why so much? Well, because it's the best, and Sony knows it. So why would a filmmaker want a 35mm prime lens? Well, because it's not a telephoto and because it's not a wide angle, it doesn't distort like a telephoto and a wide angle does. A wide angle lens really warps the perspective and it doesn't really look natural. It also exaggerates the movement to and from camera. A telephoto lens also distorts the image, but it does it the exact opposite of a wide angle lens. It actually moves the foreground and the background closer together, compressing them as it were. And any movement from front to back is minimized with a telephoto lens. Now, these shots can be cool, but they draw attention to the camera. And for that reason, feature films shy away from telephoto and wide-angle lenses because they want the attention on the subject. So if you want to make your stuff look like film, then you should be shooting somewhere around 35mm or 50 at the top. The reason I like 35mm is because it gives you a little more reach in small corners. And that really helps indie filmmakers like myself. So why don't you just use a zoom lens that has 35mm in the zoom range? Well, you could, and today's zooms have been getting really good, so it is an option, but here, let me show you. Now I've switched the lenses to my Sony 16 to 35mm power zoom lens, and I've zoomed it all the way in to 35mm, and I've opened it up as much as it can go, which is only f4, and it looks like this. So now I'm back on the 35mm prime lens, and I've set the aperture to f4 to match the zoom lens. But this can open up a lot more to f1.4, and as I do that, watch the background right there. See what happens? Yeah, it blurs out. That is what you get out of a prime lens. So is the zoom lens close enough? Well, maybe, but you can tell that the prime lens does give you more versatility. Now I've switched lenses again to the 24 to 70 G Master 2 lens. This runs about $1,000 more than the prime lens, and I've set it to 35mm to match. But it can only open up to 2.8, which is better than the 4 on the power zoom lens I showed you earlier, so the difference isn't quite as much, but let's look at the difference now with a 35. And you can see the background there, and now let's move it to 1.4. Watch closely. There it goes. Okay. Now you don't always want your background blurred, and this lens can deliver here as well because it can stop down to f16. In fact, let's just stop it at f8 because otherwise it'll get a little too dark. And you'll see that everything kind of comes into focus. This is a very versatile lens, and it's that versatility that makes this my go-to video lens. So why the Sony 35mm rather than some other brand? Well, because the Sony is the best in every single category. It has these XD linear motors that make focusing really fantastic. And because the motors are linear, you can actually pull focus by marking with a piece of tape and then pulling to that exact focus. It has a fairly close focusing distance of 9.8 inches. Of course, as a GM lens, it has high contrast and low chromatic aberration. It has an 11-blade diaphragm for smooth background blur. It's weather sealed. It has a declickable aperture ring for very smooth aperture changes. And it's small and lightweight. So for all that you get, it is clearly a bargain at $1,300. But because this lens has been out for a while, I was able to pick one up for $1,000 on eBay. The only thing it was missing was this bag. Well, not this bag, this is from another camera. So this would be a $300 bag. And I already have one and I never use it. If you'd like to get this bag for $300, check the link below. I'd be happy to sell it to you. But if $1,000 is still too much for you, then you might want to consider the second best Sony lens ever made, and that's this Sigma 35mm 1.4. The Sigma sells for $900, and I've seen it as cheap as $800 recently, and who knows what you can get it on eBay for. So this might be a great choice. So for comparison, I've rented the Sigma lens, and here they are next to each other, the Sigma and the Sony. I'll tell you a little later which one is which. See if you can tell. My guess is that you're not really sure which is which. I don't think they're going to be able to tell. Now, if you zoom in 1,000%, well, you can see there is a little difference in the bokeh balls. But guess what? No one's ever going to be zooming in 1,000% to see your bokeh balls. Sorry. Here's the Sony 35mm with the focus speed turned all the way to its fastest, and you can see it's pretty fast. In contrast, the Sigma 35 is noticeably slower, even though the settings are the same. Now, both of these lenses suffer from focus breathing, but the Sony is on the list for focus breathing compensation. So if your camera has focus breathing compensation, it's eliminated in the Sony, and you're still going to have to put up with it in the Sigma. Now, some of you may have figured out by now that the Sony is here on the left. Okay, there is a little less contrast in this Sigma, but I think I could fix this in post. One other consideration is that the Sigma lens is considerably heavier than the Sony, and you can feel it. So by now you've probably figured out that it doesn't matter much which of these lenses you choose, they will both give you a professional result. The problem though with both of these lenses is they are both boring. They're stuck at 35mm. And I know you think they're boring because a vast majority of you, when I asked what is the one lens that you would choose if you could only have one lens, you did not choose the 35. 71% of you chose the 24-70 G Master 2 lens. It is a fantastic lens, and I did an entire review about it over there. But if you're going to be a feature filmmaker, learn how to use a prime lens.